basis. So, sorry, did I hear something?
Sorry, I just started recording.
Okay, I was like, oh, who's that? But yeah, the revenue loss will certainly talk about that, changes that happened with the final rule coming out. But also I will say, and probably some of you are aware, there are going to be programs that the state is rolling out of their, $1 billion of ARPA allocation. So there's certainly opportunity, or will be opportunity likely for grant programs or other sorts of arrangements, or pairing up with state funding, and then from a local municipality standpoint. So some of those might be some of these ARPA direct dollars, as the state kind of references, where those are kind of the main, and we'll just go, point this way, remember that. Those kind of first 5 bullet points, if you will, are kind of those ARPA direct categories. If you've heard any of the state meetings or state webinars, those are kind of the most detailed compliance requirements, if you will, from the usage and eligible use standpoint. But there's a potential where, some of your cities or towns might end up being recipients of some of the money from the state, which would still have to follow a lot of the federal rules around this. So I think we will spend some time on that, because I think it could be relevant, maybe not right now, but into the future, even if you plan to use all of your money for revenue replacement. There is maybe an opportunity to apply for and kind of, again, pair up, if you will, with the state and some of their initiatives that are still going through the vetting process. That's a big part of what we're helping the state go through, is all the different, I think they said over 300 proposals or something that they've had in terms of using the state dollars across the whole state. So, but certainly we'll spend time on the revenue replacement, administrative dollars as well. Capital expenditures is a big one, which again, the changes that happened in the final rule, they did clarify some of the requirements if you end up using this for capital needs. There is a lot looser of requirements if you do capital projects under revenue replacement. So we'll kind of contrast that and talk about those differences. But certainly reporting is the big one too. So besides a few of the cities, I think across the state, most of you probably have a big reporting cycle that's due the end of April. So if you're not aware of that, now you are. We'll kind of talk through a little bit what that looks like. Some lessons learned from some of the bigger states and cities and counties that had to report at the end of January, some things that we kind of learned along the way. And then we do expect likely some more guidance coming out from the Treasury for that reporting period for you all, as likely being a non-entitlement unit, or NEU is the acronym. Your reporting period will be the end of April. So certainly though, Q&A throughout the process. I'd love to, like I said, hear kind of what's going on. If anybody was on the meeting that we hosted a few weeks ago, I talked a little bit more about kind of what specifically CLA is helping the state with from a contracting standpoint. I didn't really cover that in the slides here, but we are in the process of helping the state develop a website with resources for you all, being municipalities as well as the counties here, things that might help you as it relates to ARPA. So if you weren't on that meeting and you're here obviously, or want to take it back to the folks back at your city or town, my contact information is at the end of this. You're welcome to send any sort of feedback or things that would be really helpful from a resource standpoint, or certainly through Justin as well, is able to share some of that things that are important to you, if you will, as we're kind of helping with the resources and things into the future. So does that sound like a good plan to kind of cover this afternoon? Any other like hot topics, or I guess ARPA related, but I could talk about non-ARPA as well. So does that cover everybody, or anything off the top of your head? All right, I'm going to take that as we'll keep going here. So some of the kind of just background, you probably have heard a lot of webinars or meetings about ARPA in general, but we'll kind of fast forward to what has happened basically since last March of 2021 to now. So almost a year ago, at this point, that's when it was signed into law. The $350 billion with a B dollars that were rolled out did occur then. The several months following, there was a lot going on, and eventually that first tranche of money did come to governments across the country. So at the time, we only had the interim final rule to deal with, which was still pretty lengthy and still had a lot in there, but there was still a lot missing. So, we were all kind of going along with the interim final rule as best we could, really for the whole past 2021. So then the Treasury was very busy during that process over the holidays, I guess. They dropped the surprise on January 6, 2022, where they issued the final rule. So Initially when that was put out, it was about 437 pages. I know that because I did print all that out. They did, since then, they have this, we'll make sure everybody has a copy of the slides too, these are all live hyperlinks, but since then they made it a lot easier to read. Somewhat, it's only 117 pages now and 3 different columns, so you kind of got to zoom in, but it's a little bit easier to read. So they did put out the final rule, and then they also did put out a 44-page overview of the final rule document, which did help kind of contrast changes that happened from the interim final rule to final rule. So that did help a lot, and the biggest one being this revenue loss concept, where basically any government, regardless of if they actually had any revenue loss because of COVID-19 pandemic or not, could take basically their whole chunk of money. So, let's say you received $100,000 as your direct allocation, as you all still being considered direct recipients of the feds, even as NEUs, you're considered that. You can use all of your amounts up to the allocated amount for revenue replacement, which really just helps streamline, make the reporting a lot simpler. It's not quite as cumbersome when it comes to all the different federal rules you have to follow. So I'm sure it's been said before, and we'll say it again, is if you can go that route and it makes sense for your municipality, definitely go that route because you just have a lot more flexibility with those funds. There's still some strings attached, it's federal money, so there's always going to be strings attached, as we know. But we'll dive into that a little bit more, what you can use that on and what you can't. But I'll make a plug probably throughout this whole session is go that route if you can, if it makes sense for your government. So yeah, I mentioned the top here, the summary of the major changes. That's a pretty easy to read kind of guide to kind of walk you through some of the highlights and those changes that did happen. And then also about the same time, the Treasury did put out, it was maybe a week later, I think, they did put out a compliance and reporting guidance and user guide. And that was really very important for all the big governments that had their first reporting deadline at the end of January. So everyone across the country, states, any of the big metro cities and big counties had to scramble the past couple weeks of January to make sure that they met that deadline. I will say it was, they put out the user guide, and that's, I don't know, 80 some pages, I think, a lot of screenshots, which is somewhat helpful, but once you actually started going in there, there were some kind of uniqueness, I guess I'll say to that, because I did help some of our clients in the state with that. So that will be likely what you all have to report and do a similar exercise for your April reporting. So if you haven't looked at it already, I would suggest looking at that user guide. The Treasury has alluded to maybe making some revisions or finessing that a little bit for the April reporting. So stay tuned on that. Hopefully it's well before 2 weeks before the deadline, as it was the last time. So we're still, waiting for that as we're in the end of February now. But there are some good visuals, though, kind of screenshots of the Treasury portal that you'll have to log in and go in. So anyway, just wanted to make a mention that there is information out there. I don't think necessarily it's been opened up in terms of actually being able to log in and look at the report, is what I've heard, unless anybody's tried and been able to get it. But I have not heard that yet. So just wanted to mention that, though, there is that user guide that is a good starting point if you haven't logged in before, kind of looked at the Treasury portal, because it's kind of a different animal, if you will, related to the Treasury. The other big thing here, and this is whether you're using your ARPA funding for revenue replacement or not, there's what's called a period of performance requirement. So that's one of 12 different compliance areas that any federal program basically would be subject to. So this is one of those requirements, if you will, of period of performance of when you can actually have the underlying activity occur for the grant. So I'm sure everybody's aware, but just to kind of back up a little bit, that March 3rd, 2021 is the trigger date. So you do have to make sure that your expenditures were incurred starting that date or later. You do have to make sure that funds are obligated by the end of 2024. And then expended by the end of 2026. So obligated really means, hey, budgeted for, we've approved it, whatever needs to happen kind of at your government as far as the decision making and approval process for obligation. And then they give a little bit more time really related to capital projects. As we know, things are crazy right now with construction and supply chains and all the things. So they did reflect that a little bit and gave another 2 years basically to wrap up those projects. So just keep that in mind regardless of what path you go on. with your funding, whether you're going to do one of those ARPA direct programs or you do revenue replacement, you do have to make sure it's expended by the end of 2026. This is kind of just a hodgepodge, if you will, things to keep in mind. Probably most relevant for any of the finance or accounting folks in the room, but certainly if you are not one of those folks and somebody else at your municipality handles that, good things to share with them or take back to them, because there are some challenges, if you will, related to how to report this, how to account for it, making sure you're presenting things correctly for your audit, things like that too. So the very first one is your general ledger or your accounting system or finance system, whatever you use at your local government. You want to get it set up as best you can from the beginning, because it's a lot easier to set things up correctly from day one or as early as you can in the process versus three years from now, and you're trying to kind of find that audit trail. So as much as you can kind of have either sort of different account codes or sub projects or program codes, grant codes, things like that, depending on how sophisticated your grant program or general ledger program is for grants, I highly recommend that. If you can't track it within your financial system, your accounting system, you probably should track it separately within Excel or whatever you use, because that is going to be critical for reporting to the Treasury for these annual reports that you'll have to report to them. So just keep that in mind as far as how you want that structured within your accounting system. So whether you, this is more for your audited financial statements that likely happen every year. So the ARPA is the annual comprehensive financial report, or if you just issue financial statements, it doesn't have kind of all the extra stuff that an ARPA would have. There's certain audit considerations. So again, if this is your role or someone else at your organization is responsible for that, tracking that separately in your financial statements is going to be needed to be done. Also, the other big thing is single audit. This is subject to a single audit. So any governments across the country, as well as nonprofits that receive $750,000 or more of federal funding for each fiscal year, has to go through a single audit. Does anybody know if your municipality has gone through a single audit before? A couple, okay. So depending again on how big your allocation is, it's all over the board as far as the different governments here in Wyoming. You might have to go through a single audit for this program, or if you already have other sorts of federal funding, maybe you get passed through from WIDOT. That's actually a federal source highway planning grant, or if you have any sort of like human services type grants or HUD grants, you would have to add up all of your federal funding, all of the funding that you had during the year, and add that up to the, like I said, the $750,000 or more. That would trigger a single audit. So even if your allocation of ARPA funding is less than that, something to consider, and again, just analyze to see if you hit that trigger point. And if you do, or if you're close to it, definitely talk to your external auditors about that, because a single audit is a very deep dive into federal programs. There's a lot of compliance areas, obviously, as we've been talking about with ARPA, but just general requirements that have to be tested. So you want to make sure you're being as proactive as possible in tracking that and setting up your, like I said, your account structure. You want to make sure you have good internal controls in place, because those actually have to be audited by your external auditors if you go through a single audit. So I am an auditor by trade, so I can talk about this for a long time. We certainly don't want to do that, but it's just something to be aware of if you are close to that threshold and you haven't gone through a single audit before. There's a lot of resources out there. Your own, auditing firm can certainly help with that as well. But that would be subject to an audit. The schedule of expenditures of federal awards, or CFA, is kind of the listing of all federal programs that have to be reported on. So that's like the deliverable, if you will, of all of those federal programs, and the systems listing number is listed up there for ARPA specifically. So that's kind of the tracker. The first two digits relate to the federal agency. So in this case, the U.S. Department of Treasury is the 21, and then the last three digits is how you identify the specific program. So kind of another, compliance requirement, if you will, but this will apply to everyone who receives ARPA, is the Treasury reporting. So this is, as we've been talking about, for most of you, is probably going to be that annual April every year reporting that you'll need to do. For any of the NEUs or smaller cities and towns, I think probably only a couple of the cities do have to do it on a quarterly basis. So This is where it gets a little crazy. There's 66 different subcategories of eligible expenses under ARPA. We will kind of go through those high level. If you end up using all of your allocation for revenue replacement, that's just one category. So that's good news. But something to keep in mind if you end up doing any of these other ARPA projects, or you end up, let's say, receiving some monies through the state for any of their projects, and it's from their ARPA dollars. You might need to be aware of what those categories are, what those requirements are, because any of those direct ARPA dollars, as I was saying, public health, economic impact, premium pay, infrastructure projects. The way that Treasury has kind of set this up is that there's a lot of kind of non-financial information that has to be reported. So there's a big focus on equity. And so certain of these categories have to focus on a lot of equity components as well as key performance indicators. So the reason why I bring that up and how it's relevant to you is that if you end up pairing up with the state and receiving any of these state dollars that are ARPA funded, they might require additional information from you all as far as, hey, who are you serving with these dollars? How are you going to hit these milestones or performance metrics, things like that. So that's not to scare you, but just as a heads up, it is a requirement from the federal perspective, and that's why the state might ask for that if you're going to proceed any of those funds. So I kind of alluded to it, but the central repository for reporting is the Treasury portal, and I have a couple slides later on that goes through, if you haven't logged in yet, what are kind of the ways you need to set that up and what you need to consider. So we'll cover that. Preparing early, of course, through this discussion that we're having at the conference, but certainly other webinars and resources that are online, as well as us, CLA, being a resource to the municipalities of Wyoming through the state. Assistance is certainly another resource for any specific questions or things that you all might have as we take a little bit closer to that April reporting. But you definitely don't want to wait until the day before the end of April. You want to plan for that and really make sure you set yourself up in a good way for that reporting requirement. Let's move a little bit more high level, but in general, any sort of messaging or how you're messaging this, not just to your employees of your government, but the general constituents of your municipality and all the citizens of your area. What are you spending your ARPA dollars on? One of the requirements in ARPA is to be transparent, and actually the bigger governments, such as the state, do have to be very transparent on what they're doing. So they are required to have public information, and having information on a website, for instance, that's actually part of the federal requirement. So, what's being spent on, what are those categories? That's why it's so important from a tracking standpoint to make sure you can have accurate information. So just kind of the spirit of ARPA, if you will, is all about transparency. And, I mentioned already the equity side of things and dealing with this ongoing pandemic, impacts on a lot of the disproportionately impacted communities is a big part of that. The last bullet I'll touch on here is, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity with this influx of ARPA funds across the country. And then add on that some of the other programs that are coming out, such as the infrastructure bill and other things that I probably can't just name off the top of my head. But really, are there other federal or state sources available for certain things, and kind of weighing out what are you going to use what for. So that's just more of an awareness thing. I mentioned several times that there are going to be programs that the state is going to roll out for local governments here in Wyoming. So just something to be aware of, and making sure that you understand what requirements are what. ARPA would be different than the infrastructure bill requirements, for instance. Did I scare anybody yet? You guys are bearing with me? Okay. I promise it's you can bite it off in smaller pieces, but really just try to set everybody up for success from the beginning. If you haven't spent your money yet, try and just think of these things of tracking, reporting, because that will have to be done with the Treasury. Keep pointing the wrong way. So this is more, may or may not be relevant, for you all, but if you are giving any sort of monies to others, so maybe nonprofits within your community, there's a concept called and one of the requirements under ARPA is subrecipient monitoring. So kind of what the relationship is, if you have experienced federal funds before, so let's just do the state for an example. So the state receives ARPA dollars, which are federal dollars passed to the state. The state passes money, let's just say, to one of your municipalities here to carry out some sort of program, helping a homeless shelter, something like that. Typically that relationship would be considered a subrecipient relationship. So you all as a municipality would actually be considered a subrecipient of the state. And what that means and why that matters is because you're actually carrying out a portion of a program on behalf of the state. To contrast that, there's a concept of a beneficiary. So that's more of, same sort of flow, if you will, of money, but that actual entity that's receiving that money is benefiting from that. So that tends to be an actual nonprofit that is receiving a grant to sustain its operations, let's just say. So they're not actually like passing that to anyone else, or they're not having to report more information back to you all, let's say, as a municipality. So the reason why I bring that up is because that is a requirement under ARPA, is this subrecipient monitoring and risk assessment process. So what that means is basically there's strings attached. So that typically is outlined in an agreement that, in this case, as I was describing, the state might have an agreement with one of your governments and say, hey, you need to make sure that this is subject to a single audit. If you reach a certain threshold, you need to provide us with quarterly reports. You need to give us, this key performance indicator information, whatever they might require under that grant. And so then the state has to follow up on that, make sure that you all as a municipality is providing that you actually provide any audit results if this goes through an audit. There's a lot of just kind of monitoring type requirements that I'm talking about. So that's also, that same relationship can happen with, so you all as a municipality receive your ARPA dollars and you actually pass this to a nonprofit to serve a homeless population, let's say for instance. That relationship likely would be a subrecipient relationship between you as the municipality and the nonprofit organization. So same sort of requirements would apply, same sort of, hey, we want to make sure we have a good agreement in place, all the checking of the boxes. So it's just another added layer of reporting, of compliance requirements. If you do go down that route and pass monies to third parties, typically nonprofits is usually the best example there. So just something to keep in mind versus, internal recipient would be kind of, hey, we're going to give this money to our Department of Public Works or something like that to use for XYZ purposes. That would be that internal requirement that we wouldn't have to go through a subrecipient type process. So again, might not apply to you all, but certainly it could apply if you are a subrecipient to state in future projects. One of the other things is, the audit trail, making sure that internal controls are documented, because if you end up going through a single audit, as I talked about before, your auditor is actually going to issue an audit opinion over your controls. So what that means is you have to have evidence that a control happened. So, hey, we had a separate person sign off on this invoice. We had our city council approve a contract, and that's documented in the minutes. All these sorts of kind of examples of an internal control, making sure you have that documented. That the auditors, if they came in a year from now, can look at that. So same sort of thing with any sort of decisions that are being made with ARPA funds, what kind of projects you have. If you end up giving monies to other, third parties, nonprofits, or doing any of these sort of ARPA direct programs, you do want to make sure that there's a review of those to make sure they are eligible under the ARPA requirements. So again, something to keep in mind if you have that. And then this whole, supporting documentation up front. That'll make your lives easier for this reporting that's due to the Treasury, like I said, once a year. So just making sure that that's readily available, whether it's hard copy or electronic support. This, may or may not apply to you all, just depending on the size of your city or town. But having some sort of team that's ultimately kind of governing and responsible for your ARPA program is recommended. We had put out an article CLA, and you're welcome to look at that, available for anyone, about things to consider from a stakeholder perspective, who involved. The biggest thing is that this is one-time money. So if you have any sort of debt or things like that, potentially you might want to talk through, if your bond holders or if you're looking to go out for debt later on. So something other stakeholders, I guess, besides your typical readers of financial statements, besides, you know, your auditors, or what have you. So there's a lot of more information in there about who to consider, and you're welcome to take a look at that. All right, so that's kind of the overview. Now we're going to jump into more of those specific eligible uses of ARPA. So I mentioned 5. Public health is probably the most obvious one, I would say, because yeah, this is a, you know, pandemic, a health issue. So a lot of these are probably similar to if anyone had received CARES Act dollars or coronavirus relief fund dollars at all through the state potentially in the past, you know, year and a half. These will be all very similar uses, I would say. But if not, you know, nothing I don't think here is too shocking. So this is actually from the Treasury and Treasury's compliance guide. So I mentioned 66 subcategories. Public health has 12, I guess, right? Yeah, 12 total categories. And the reason why this is important is because this is how you actually report this within the Treasury portal for that annual reporting. So you do have to kind of, once you get into the portal for the reporting, select the right category, if you will. So this kind of gives you a heads up as far as what are all those different categories. If you did have any sort of these public health expenses that you are claiming as part of your ARPA amount. So, you know, things like vaccinations, testing, PPE, medical expenses, all those are pretty obvious, but some of the maybe more unique ones is it does talk about capital investments to public facilities. May or not apply to the municipalities in this group, but just wanted to point that one out. Payroll costs for public health, safety, and other public sector staff, mental health services, substance use, and other public health services. So any of those that have the little star, the asterisk next to it, requires additional reporting, if you will. So if you end up having any of the spending in these categories and are claiming it for your allocation, there is some additional things to be aware of. And that's in the guide, but I just want to point that out. Same thing is with the little, I don't know, carrot or whatever, at the very top, whatever those are. There's actually additional kind of tracking and things you have to report. I think it's, I can't remember, maybe it's like the number of people served or something like that. But again, just something to keep in mind is that some of these categories, any of them that have the little extra marks next to them, do require some additional information. And I'm just going to double check my list here to make sure I'm saying that right. So yeah, little asterisks, you would have to identify the total amount of funds that are allocated to evidence-based interventions. So that's a whole another section within ARPA if you have any of those. And then the little carrot sign, recipients must report on whether projects are primarily serving disadvantaged communities. So that's a definition we'll talk about in a second here, but just something to keep in mind. There are additional requirements if you have any of those sort of things. Now I have just kind of some overviews. I'm not going to go through all this in great detail, but these are things, again, that would fall under that public health bucket. So mitigation, prevention, behavioral health, you know, that's really as we're all seeing a big, huge impact. And I know certainly in the state is the behavioral health concerns that are happening. So that is an eligible use, as well as preventing and responding to violence. There's a lot of dialogue within the ARPA guidelines about that. There's probably no way you can read all this, so don't try, but we have links in the back of the slide that would have all this in detail. This just gives you what Treasury threw out the final rule. They call it an enumerated eligible uses. So basically they're saying, hey, if you have any of these, that's automatically eligible under ARPA. And they did a pretty good job. It's, you know, you can see this is a very lengthy list just for public health, but really I think the takeaway is that this can give you some ideas for programs or maybe being more innovative in your communities with these dollars, because that's really, you know, the point is this is trying to be, you know, it's not reactionary at the onslaught of the pandemic. This is more the recovery, you know, long-term, several years to come, really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to use these dollars for certain purposes. So I think it's kind of interesting, and you know, as I was reading through this, like, oh, wow, I didn't think about that. And so, you know, certainly the guidance has a lot more detail behind this, but they do have some good real examples that could be used for these dollars. So more on the medical expense side, again, same sort of thing. They do talk about being able to reimburse for, you know, unreimbursable expenses for medical care, paid family and medical leave, emergency medical treatment of long-term symptoms, so more uses there. Here's a bunch of the, I kind of mentioned this already, a bunch of the enumerated eligible uses for behavioral health care. So quite a few different options here. I know the state is looking at some of these as well, just with a lot of their programs. Another big, I kind of mentioned this too, preventing and responding to violence. Certainly, all sorts of statistics and things that got a lot worse, unfortunately, with COVID-19. And so they do recognize that within ARPA and do have quite a few different community violence intervention program uses as well. So again, if your community is impacted, could be a place to look if you're looking at any sort of different programs. All right, so that was the public health topic. Any questions on the public health specifically before we switch gears to the second and third eligible uses? Everybody's good to go. All right, stay with me here. So these two are pretty lengthy, and this is where I think in a good way a lot of creative uses of these funds can happen. And this I would say is a big area of focus for the state overall with a lot of the programs that are coming out is how do we really respond to these negative economic impacts and then services to these disproportionately impacted communities, which gets a little tricky kind of how they define those, but we'll kind of walk through what that looks like. So, again, 14 potential uses under this category for negative economic impact. So again, if you have any sort of programs that fall under this, you would have to take note and report it in your treasury reporting as one of these eligible use categories. So a bunch of different household assistance programs. So those would actually be, recipients would be community members within your municipality. And kind of the relationship, how that would work, to maybe bring it back to some of the conversation we had earlier, those would be beneficiaries of the program. So meaning, hey, a household within your, within your jurisdiction is receiving eviction prevention assistance dollars. So they would be a beneficiary because they're actually benefiting from those dollars, versus a subrecipient would be typically a nonprofit who is then maybe determining who's going to receive those monies in some sort of rent program, let's just say, for instance. So yeah, any of those household assistance programs typically would be a beneficiary of your city or town if you're going to do any of those. Unemployment benefit or cash assistance. Job training, I think this is kind of a cool one where they talk about, helping with employment support or incentive type programs, specific training for jobs. So there's a lot of dialogue in the final rule about that. Small business economic assistance, aid to nonprofit organizations, aid to tourism, travel, and hospitality, aid to other impacted industries. Those are all, there's some very specific requirements that you can use those monies for, but it's kind of interesting. They basically say any impacted industry falling in tourism, travel, or hospitality is kind of automatically eligible, but also other industries could be impacted. I think they say if there was like an 8% loss during the COVID-19, first 2 years, then they would be impacted. There's more in the details there, but that's another usage of that. The last category here too is one for actual government. So rehiring public sector staff, there's a bunch of requirements in there that you could use this for, with returning, if you had to lay people off or things like that during the pandemic, but bringing those people back, restoring your FTEs is also eligible use. You probably can't see this, so I apologize, but it's a little bit harder to see. This would be then the disproportionately impacted community uses. So at the very top here, a bunch of uses of this for education assistance. So really helping, we said disproportionately impacted communities. So your high poverty areas or other impacted communities is really where this would trigger. Healthy childhood, there's quite a few on services to foster families, foster youth, things like that under healthy childhood. Going down here, and then housing support. So this is one that the state's still kind of going through, if you will, from a vetting out process and seeing if it is allowable. But affordable housing is one of the eligible uses, which we know is a huge concern across the country and certainly here in the state. So we certainly hope that ends up being supported at the state level and can go forward with that from an affordable housing standpoint. And then social determinants of health. There's some other areas. Lead remediation is one of them, as well as community violence intervention. So, so again, some, I think, pretty interesting ideas that can kind of, things you can take back to your government if they apply and are needed in your community. So kind of going in here, I'm not going to read all this in detail, but this is how they define those groups, if you will. So assistance to households, an impacted household versus a disproportionately impacted household. A lot of words here and things, but basically low to moderate income households or communities which fall below a certain federal poverty guideline is how you would measure those if you have that in your community. And then also there's kind of a list of, hey, if you have any of these households within your community, they would automatically be eligible under this. So a lot of the federal programs, children's health insurance program, CHIP, or the child care development fund, CCDF program, Medicaid, affordable housing initiatives will go under here. Services for lost instructional time for K-12 schools would also fall under there as well. Disproportionately impacted, kind of similar, any of those low-income households as well. Any qualified census tract locations, so depending on what community you're in, you might fall under one of those. Any of these other federal programs, all these other households, TANF, SNAP, the child nutrition programs, Medicare, women and infant children with program, Section 8, LIHEAP, the low-income heating energy systems program. Those would all fall under there. So basically what that means is if you have those sorts of households in your community, they would automatically fall under this category and be eligible for these programs if you end up doing that. These are all the different example projects, if you will, which we covered some of these already. But different projects that the Treasury does talk about, food assistance, food banks, emergency housing assistance, financial services for unbanked or underbanked individuals, burial assistance, cash assistance, child care, affordable housing would all be eligible uses and example projects. Over on the right, some different ones to pull out your housing vouchers, investments in neighborhoods to promote improved health outcomes, improvements to vacant and abandoned property. That one I think is eligible if you're going to basically fix a property for potential affordable housing initiatives. That would be eligible. Schools, educational public facilities. So a lot of information, probably why this was 400 pages when it first came out, because there's a lot of information within here. So, okay, switching gears a little bit now, going to the assistance of small businesses. So we all know that, small businesses were certainly impacted with the pandemic and continue to be. And so the Treasury did recognize that, and this would be kind of the definition, if you will, that they talk about of what a small business would be. No more than 500 employees that are a small business concern as defined by this act, if you will, Small Business Act, which would basically the definition of independently owned and operated, not dominant in the field of operation. So that's how they would classify definition of a small business. What you can actually, how you define that, if you will, to actually give aid, they bucket it very similar to the households. They bucket it as impacted small businesses versus disproportionately impacted small businesses. So these are pretty broad categories, which is good. Most likely most small businesses would need one of these. So, a decrease in revenue because of the pandemic, financial security, increased costs, financial hardship issues and challenges in covering operating costs. So probably most businesses would fall under that. The disproportionately impacted small businesses. So if they were actually in a qualified census tract, if they were operated by a tribal government or operated by U.S. territory. So probably most would fall on the left. Your left there. Impacted small business category. If you guys know. These are some of the example projects, not certainly as lengthy as the household projects, but I think it does capture a lot, if you will. So any sorts of loans or grant programs that you might do from your government to a small business would qualify. I would definitely, if you're thinking about doing this, go the grant route and not the loan route. There's a lot of other nuances with loans within the ARPA guidance that are just pretty complicated, and I would just highly advise just doing a straight up grant program where they don't need to be spending dollars there. This one's a little bit interesting, the technical assistance counseling or other business planning services. So kind of getting at the helping these businesses sustain another issue that might happen, or other sorts of things from a planning perspective, if you will, kind of similar to the right side here where it talks about in the middle, technical assistance, business incubators, grants for startup or expansion. This very first one too would be kind of more of the physical improvements for an actual storefront as well. So again, just some ideas, whether you go this route or not, are just examples here. Oh yeah, question.
To get a question in from Evanston, and I think the slide gets to it just a little bit, but maybe you could expand on it. For the small business, is it just for existing businesses, or could it be used for new businesses?
Yeah, that one gets a little tricky. So within the details of the guidance, they pretty much say the business needed to be in existence before the pandemic for a lot of these. But I think if you start like narrowing it down into a specific, like if it's a new business and you're looking for startup assistance, I think it could likely be eligible, but that would be one you probably want to dive into a little bit more, just depending on what that program is. So yeah, good question on that. But yeah, generally, I know that they do talk about they need to be in existence before COVID, basically. So all right, let's see here. So nonprofits, another certainly hugely impacted area related to nonprofits. So very similar though, as far as the definitions of small businesses. So I'll keep going through there. So I'm gonna make sure to give time for the revenue loss topic. Same sort of thing, loans or grants. Again, go the grant route if you're thinking about doing this for nonprofits. Avoid the loan route is my suggestion. Okay, there we go. Aid to impacted industry. There we go. So I mentioned this travel, tourism, hospitality sector would kind of automatically qualify, or if you had other sort of impacted industries within your community, they would have to experience at least 8% employment loss from pre-pandemic levels, or they experience a comparable or worse economic impact as the national travel, tourism, hospitality sector. So if you have that, you have to kind of go through this analysis and calculations. But you can provide very similar things to what we've already talked about with a lot of the other ones, aid to help mitigate financial hardship, technical assistance, mitigation, helping with, future issues with COVID and social distancing, things like that. This one is another use, if you will, under this. So public sector, so that would be the actual governments and salaries. You are able to use that for public safety, public health, and human services staff. You can only charge it though for related to COVID-19 type activities. So if you're looking to go down that route, make sure you look at the guidance. There's a lot of kind of nuances you have to make sure you track there. The rehiring, I think I mentioned that already. They do actually, there's a discussion there about worker retention incentives though. So I think that's a really positive one too, especially as, hiring is tough no matter who you are, but certainly the government sector helping with some of that, and retention, I should say, as well. And then admin costs to help in hire support and support those retention programs. Premium pay is kind of a interesting topic. I haven't seen a lot of governments go this route. Is anybody considering premium pay at all? Okay, sounds like no. I'm gonna kind of skip. Oh, maybe one. Okay, all right. We'll go through it quickly. I just want to make sure we give questions. Time for questions at the end, but you can do premium pay. There's just a lot of hoops you have to go through if you go this route. So that's just my word of caution, if you will. If you go the premium route, premium pay route, it is up to $13 per hour. It must be in addition to wages, on top of kind of their base compensation, if you will, for your governments. It cannot exceed $25,000 for any single worker. It can be awarded in installments or lump sums. It can be paid retrospectively, but it cannot be used to reimburse itself for premium or hazard pay already received. So like if you had done this, 2 years ago or right after the pandemic, you can't just reimburse yourself for that. It has to actually be money out the door. There's a lot of steps to go through if you go that route. So just something again to keep in mind. Personally, I'd probably avoid this just because it's a lot of work to have to go through. There might be other programs you could do, but it's still a very worthy endeavor though if you are able to quantify and go through all that. There's just a lot of documentation is really the takeaway there.
Allison?
Yeah.
If this was something that our folks had kind of worked a ways down before the final rule came out, now if they're if they're writing off their award amount to lost revenue, do these rules still apply?
Good question. So if everybody heard him, basically the question was, if you were planning to do premium pay, for example, before the final rule came out, and now you want to just take the revenue allowance, up to $10 million, can you still do this? And so if you are not classifying this as premium pay, you are classifying as just a usage under revenue replacement is basically the question. Do all those rules apply? I think you have to be very careful in that. I probably would call it something a little different. I wouldn't straight up call it a premium pay, because the reason why I say that is you still have to report to the Treasury what you're using revenue replacement dollars on. So, hey, we're going to use it to pay, payroll for our public safety workers and XYZ usages. I think I would frame it a little bit of a different way, but I think the concepts you could still certainly do, for your government. So I would just be a little bit careful how you're wording things. If you go the revenue replacement route, maybe keep it more broad, but I don't think you'd have to follow like all these things if you're not going to classify it under that category. So.
Well, and as a follow-up to the existing business versus new business question, the other question that they posed was if there was an existing business that you were trying to attract to your community, again, if you're doing the revenue replacement, would you be able to say, categorize that as economic development dollars, something like that?
Yeah, no, you can call it, basically whatever you want. As long as the key with revenue replacement is as long as you're actually providing something to the community. So you can't just sit on the money, you can't just put it in reserves. That's a big no-no. But if you're actually providing something, so in this case, you have some sort of program, then yes, you could definitely do that under your revenue replacement dollars and not maybe have to follow all the super strict rules as these other direct programs are. So does that help answer that question?
Yep.
Okay. Here's all the example categories, if you will, of eligible workers under premium pay if you do go that route. Water, sewer, broadband is the, I think, fifth, if I'm counting right, category of direct dollars. This one, I think, some of the future projects or projects that probably will get funded and approved from the state. This is maybe where, some grant programs might happen. So just something to keep in mind as we kind of fast forward once a lot of the state programs move a little bit farther. So we have 17 categories here under these programs. So a lot of the clean water and drinking water, if any of the local governments participate in any of the state revolving funds with water and drinking water projects, clean water and drinking water projects, it's all very similar uses, if you will, and similar types of projects. So just something to keep in mind there. Also, this is where broadband falls into place, which I know is another potential state initiative. And using ARPA dollars as well. So these are all, really the big ticket dollars, obviously as it relates to capital expenditures that are really, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for this influx of money for very long, long shelf life, if you will, for a lot of these projects. So I do think that's going to be the way of a lot of governments across the country. These are so clean water state revolving fund projects, I kind of mentioned that they're basically the same types of categories. So hopefully these, if you participated in these in the past, it's all very, very similar uses. And so if any of the projects roll out that way, or if you're looking to do that with your own allocation, these would be those kind of example projects that the Treasury has talked about. Same thing with drinking water. They also have example projects there. They do talk about the projects being necessary or other, other necessary projects. So this would be a little bit different from kind of those traditional clean water, drinking water revolving programs, but still considered necessary. So probably the biggest ones, culvert repair, dam and reservoir rehab, and then a whole lot of stuff about lead remediation as well that would be eligible. They define what necessary is, which is somewhat intuitive, I would say, but making sure that it's cost effective, that there has been alternatives considered, investments to meet certain population growth or sustainability of useful lives as well. Broadband is another big category that I think is really exciting across the country to really, I know certainly here in the state, I think would apply of getting, a lot bigger broadband reach, if you will, across the state. So that is one of the eligible uses as well. So There's certain requirements though that projects have to go through with all that. So talking about certain like minimum speeds, if you will, for the internet service. There's a lack of access, lack of affordable broadband, lack of reliable service. You can probably all think of places that meet those definitions. They do also require the service provider that would, install the broadband, put the broadband in to participate in a low-income subsidy program. So there are additional requirements, if you will, if you go this route as far as who you're actually having to do the work. One other kind of this is added in the final rule. We all know, I'm sure you're aware of all the just general cybersecurity risks that are happening across the country. Pre-COVID as well, but after COVID, with a lot of just bad actors throughout the country with cybersecurity, they do actually allow that under this category as a usage to help with cybersecurity issues for governments. All right, so a lot of build up to the public sector revenue loss section. That's probably the most relevant for you all. But that was kind of to kind of get the wheels turning hopefully a little bit as far as some of those other eligible uses and things that you could consider, or potentially if you're going to be a recipient of funds through the state's ARPA dollars as well. So this was the major news, as I've already talked about quite a bit, but that big change in the final rule did talk about up to $10 million of revenue loss being just a standard allowance. And all that looks like in that project and expenditure report, it's literally like a drop down that you just say, are you taking the standard allowance? And you say yes if you are. So it's pretty easy actually in the project and expenditure reporting. You do though have to give a narrative of what you're using those dollars for. So just something to keep in mind. It doesn't, I don't think, have to be a long novel, but a couple paragraphs of what you're actually using those dollars for is required in that April reporting. It does, so I mentioned this before, but it does cover that period of performance. You still have to use those dollars within that basically March 2021 to December 2026 timeframe. So this biggest takeaway here, these expenditures do not have to qualify under one of the other ARPA categories, so not the five we just ran through, but they do have to fall in the same timeframe. CLA had a webinar just on ARPA revenue loss calculations and kind of nuances there. So if you wanted to take a look at the slides or watch that, you're welcome to as well. We could probably spend 3 days talking about ARPA if you can't tell. There's a lot here. So these are the enumerated uses that the Treasury outlines as far as examples of revenue loss dollars. So these are basically givens, if you will. So if you have any of these categories at your government, these are considered automatically eligible. You will have to say what you're using them for, so keep that in mind, but these are automatically eligible. This is not all-inclusive though, so as we kind of talked about, hey, you could still kind of tweak the program or still use it for something different, but these are kind of the automatic ones. So construction, road building and maintenance, health services, general government administration, staff and administrative facilities, that captures a whole lot, I would say, in that category. Environmental remediation or provision for police, fire, and other public safety services. So this is really the key takeaway. This last one, government services generally include any service traditionally provided by a government unless Treasury states otherwise. So that's where I'm saying it has to be something you're actually providing as a service to your community. You can't just sit on the money. So that's one of the no-nos, if you will. You have to make sure that you're actually saying what you're using this for. And that's where you can kind of, I'm not going to say play games because that would be terrible to say as an auditor. But if you're going to say, hey, I got $100,000 of ARPA monies, I'm going to apply that to my police, fire, and administrative salaries at my municipality. Right there, that's probably over $100,000. Then that money or that savings that you used, you can use for anything. That would just be general fund monies, right? So you can kind of cleanse the money a little bit if it was traditionally paid for out of general fund. Let's say monies, you're going to say, I'm going to use this for ARPA dollars. The biggest key though is that this is not for recurring money, right? So it's one-time use. And that's what can get a bit tricky from a budget standpoint. But it does free up additional general fund dollars though, if you're going to just say, hey, this chunk is going to go towards salaries is a big easy one for governments usually because there's so much that is paid out of salaries because you're providing services with those salaries. But that's probably the easiest win or easiest usage, I guess I would say, is on the salary side of things. Does that make sense, or any questions on that kind of concept?
I just have a couple.
Yeah, questions. Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, if you take the election as a grade, this revenue loss. I'm assuming then we're taking it for the 2 years because we're gonna have to compliance next April for our second payment.
Yes, yeah, this will probably be, you'll probably have to report this for several years. We're not exactly sure how that's gonna look, but given the delays and some of the things that have come out and what that affects, you will have to report that likely for a couple of those April reportings. Yep.
And then, so we're saying, okay, this takes care of my police department budget year. Do I have to, do you have to upload any payroll documents or any?
No.
Have to make, put that to that.
Yeah, so the question is, you have to upload like underlying payroll details into the treasury, unless they change it, which I don't think they would. You just have to give a narrative, so you just have to talk about what you're using it for. My suggestion though is making sure you keep that audit trail of how you calculated that though. So keep that documentation in place, because one, you might be asked for it down the road. If the treasury comes in, the state comes in, your own auditors, whoever. So make sure you have a backup of, okay, we're gonna say $100,000. How did you get to that amount? So just make sure you retain that documentation. Based on, I think they say like 7 years or something crazy. As far as how many years you have to keep records of that. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, what I saw with the January reporting, you will not have to upload like supporting details of that. Good question. Yeah, thank you. All right. So again, caveat, if you will, there are restrictions still to this, and I kind of talked about the biggest ones, but we'll kind of just roll through these. This is more at the state level, is definitely a no, but you can't just use this to give like tax refunds to your community members. So they do say you can't do that. You cannot put this into pension funds. So if you do have that at your community, you cannot do that. This part B is really the biggest one. You cannot use this to pay debt service. So if you do have any debt, you cannot pay debt service, and you cannot just put this in like a rainy day fund. You can't put this in reserves. You have to actually use it for something. So like that's why we're talking about payroll as an example. So you can't just sit on it. Settlements and judgments get a little tricky. If you had to pay some sort of legal enforcement, let's say to follow CDC rules, that's okay. But if you have some sort of like lawsuit going on, you can't use it for that usage. And then there's other general restrictions in the terms and conditions that you all probably signed when you took on those monies from the treasury. So just keep in mind those kind of, I think it was again 5 or 7 pages that you decided terms and conditions. I covered kind of this first one. If anybody does have an OPEB, other post-employment benefits plan, they don't specifically address that, but I would also avoid any sort of deposits into that, because it's very similar to a pension fund. I covered a lot of this already. Again, this is the reason why they say debt service and financial reserves, you can't use it, is they're saying this is not considered a government service to constituents. So you have to actually give something or use it for some sort of governmental purpose. They also say make sure you're not using this for anything that's contrary to the ARPA rules. So I don't know what that would be, but some sort of like anti-masking program or something like that. You don't want to use that for these purposes, because you want to have it in the spirit of ARPA and making sure that it's following kind of all the different federal rules. All right, so that was really the big thing on revenue replacement. You can use another category is administrative expenses. I'll kind of go through this pretty quick because this may or may not apply to you as well. This is more if you are having to hire additional folks to help manage your program. This is where like our contract with the state, CLA's contract with the state is getting paid out of administrative dollars. So legal services, if you have to hire an outside attorney to help with some of your ARPA compliance, that would fall under here. If you end up transferring any of your money to another government, so let's say you're trying to, another city, a bigger city maybe has the resources, so you're going to transfer your funds to them for some sort of bigger project, that is allowable as well. Capital expenditures, if you end up doing any sort of big capital projects, you can do that under revenue loss. So like, let's say you're renovating, one of your government buildings, you can use your revenue loss dollars. I think I mentioned that some of the examples there. There's a lot less requirements for projects if you use the revenue loss versus public health and negative economic impacts. You'll see in a second when I say that. But basically, depending on, like, let's say you are going to build a new public health building or something like that. Depending on how many dollars it is, so if it's less than $1 million, between $1 million and 10 million, or 10 million or more, there's a lot of analysis and justification you have to go through to document that. So written justification, I think we cover that here. So you have to describe the harm, you have to talk about what was impacted, you have to explain why this capital expenditure is appropriate versus like two other alternatives, like leasing or things like that. And then, yeah, this is very bottom, comparison of proposed capital projects against at least two alternative capital projects and determine why this is superior. So basically, long story short, they are saying you cannot use this. These are actually ineligible use presumptions within the Treasury's guidance, and saying you cannot do all these things with it. So this would be another one of those where I would probably avoid any sort of capital projects under economic assistance or negative economic impacts. And if you go the revenue loss, you won't have to necessarily go this route. It's just kind of the heads up. But they specifically say do not do these. So construction of new correctional facilities, new congregate facilities. So that's basically like, hey, we're gonna just build a whole new nursing home versus can we renovate the current nursing home or change the facility a little bit? So they actually say that's not allowed. Construction of convention centers, stadiums, or other large capital projects for general economic development is not allowed either. So those are just, more so probably at the state level, more applicable, but just a heads up there. They do, in the spirit of Treasury and federal rules, they do want you to make sure that you're following strong labor standards and high labor standards, any sort of, entities that you're contracting with, construction companies, things like that. If one of the non-enumerated uses, so if there is some sort of other impact you're analyzing, you have to go through even more steps. So again, this is why I would just avoid all this completely. It's a lot of work. All right, reporting, our last big topic here. So I kind of mentioned the project and expenditure reporting is that April timeframe that we've been talking about, so that is right around the corner. That user guide has been put out there. So that is something that is out there for you all right now. The Treasury has alluded to sending out more information though, as we get closer to that time period. Some of the nuances of that were a little confusing and not as intuitive as I think we expected. So some of that portal might change a little bit, but these are the things you definitely want to make sure you get set up now, if you can, if you have not done that yet. So if anybody's gone through the ID registration process, did anybody have to do that here? All right, yeah, painful, right? So make sure that you've gone through that if you have not done that already. And then there's 3 roles, if you will, within the actual Treasury portal. So you do have to designate at least one of the 3 roles. You can designate all of these, and this is a good way to have a good segregation of duties so that you have someone that is different entering in the information versus certifying it. So when you log into the portal, which everybody should have access to the portal now, there's just not going to be a lot in there at this point, but keep in mind who you want to have do each of these roles at your government. So account administrator, point of contact for reporting, so that's a lot of like the email blasts that come out from the Treasury, and then authorized representative for reporting is really kind of like the top level who's certifying your report to the Treasury before hitting the submit button. This is probably really small for everybody to see, but there are 6 different tiers. And so if you're not sure what tier you fall into, there's a link of the different tiers there at the very bottom. Any of the non-entitlement units, which is probably the vast majority of folks in this room, you are a tier 6. And so the only requirement you have is that you can see the April 30th, 2022, and then annually thereafter is that project and expenditure report. More as an FYI, so like the very tier 1 is the state of Wyoming. They had to do an interim report. They have to do quarterly project and expenditure reports, and then the big recovery plan performance report is every year starting in, I think, yeah, the next one is July. So that's where a lot of those like equity and key performance metrics have to be reported, and a lot of the kind of like qualitative and quantitative factors have to be reported. So that'll be a big deadline for the state. And then any of the, you can see tier 2, there's probably maybe a few folks that receive more than $10 million who would likely fall into that category. But the vast majority here in this room is probably the very bottom tier, tier 6. All right, so that was everything on the reporting. Here's just a bunch of webinars that CLA has hosted that you're able to access if you're interested, or pass this along to others at your municipality. We have one coming up on March 8th, which is really getting into the summer recipient concept, if this applies to you, or you will be a summer recipient of the state. We have a bunch of other ones that you're welcome to access the slides of the webinar. The very bottom one is a bunch of treasury webinars that they put out there as well.
Allison,
Yeah, oh yeah,
we'll distribute the slide deck,
yeah.
so.
Yeah, you
all
guys don't need to write this down, yeah, we'll distribute the slides, yeah, yep, thank you. This also just has some resources, I'm sure everybody's aware, but the very top is really everything that you need to know about ARPA, so the final rule, all the documents I was referencing. The compliance supplement is something that if you end up going through a single audit that I was talking about before, that's something your external auditors look at and have to follow when they're going through the audit. So it's kind of a heads up as far as what they would be looking at. So there's a new one every year. So we don't have the 2022 one yet. That's usually in like kind of late spring, summer time frame. But they did put this out there for ARPA. So you can take a look at there. Our website has a bunch of stuff on there too if you're interested. And then the uniform guidance I mentioned, which does govern ARPA, so some of those general kind of federal requirements that all grants have to follow, that's a live link to that as well. All right, so we left a couple minutes. That was a lot of content. Thanks for bearing with me, but any other questions, comments? Everybody feel good about this? So I'm seeing some smiles, so I guess that's a good sign. The questions back there, yeah.
When is Justin going to have these available for us?
This and all the other PowerPoints, I usually have to beat one or two of those out of presenters. Obviously, I already have Allison, so by the first day or two next week, Judy, probably Monday though.
You are a darling, thank you. I didn't see you up there, I thought you were.
He's front and center, the only one up here with me.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Very
Good, yeah, thank you. And I think I mentioned it early on, but if you all have other, hot topics, things that you're really curious on, we are developing that website, as I mentioned, for the state to have resources available for you all. So feel free to, I think, my contact information will be in there. You can send it to Justin as well. Any, comments, feedback, things like that you're really looking for, we can make sure to consider and incorporate it. We're kind of developing those resources. So you're welcome to reach out to me directly. I'm not the only one at CLA, but I'm kind of as you said, the face of it. I don't know if that's good or bad, but we're working very hard at developing a lot of those resources. So please feel free to reach out though if you anything else that we can help out with and be adjusted to. Anything else online or we're good?
Nope, good.
All right. Anything else? Enjoy the rest of your conference and the sun is shining, so it can't be better than that. Thanks everyone.